Scott Stinson, National Post writer, joining us now. How's it going, Scott?
Good. How are you guys doing?
Not bad. Not bad.
Good.
Reed's got his Canadian football toque on there. You guys call it a toque up there. We call it a beanie. We call it a beanie down here, and my Canadian friends are like, "What? That's the thing." Anyway,
yeah.
How's everything? How's everything going up there with the COVID situation? And
well, it's funny. It relates very specifically with the Canadian Football League in that we are waiting to hear essentially what is going to happen with the 2021 season because. In a very broad sense, Canada was a little bit behind the U.S. in terms of vaccinations. And so whereas things have opened up and fans are back in stands in the States, we're not there yet. They're getting to the point now where I think we're, a few weeks away, less than a month from having some of the decisions made in terms of approvals and borders opening up potentially and things like that. But right now, the CFL came out with a plan, so to speak, a few weeks ago saying we hope to have everything sorted out for an early August start. And we'd be able to make decisions by the mid-June. And, it's almost June now and no decisions have been made. So I think we're getting down to the brass tacks in terms of they need to see that the provinces continue to improve in terms of COVID numbers and positive cases, and then they go from there to approving some sort of return to play plan, probably without any fans in the stands in the early going. And then from there, potentially we're going to have some sort of CFL 2021 season. But it's almost like the fight against COVID in Canada very much mirrors the situation with the CFL right now, because it's kind of a hold and see and hope everything continues to improve over the next couple of weeks. And then I think some firm decisions will be made.
How do you feel right now, optimistically, about everything?
I think that they are on track to have some sort of season. I think the one thing that could derail that possibility is if, say, for example, Ontario or Quebec, there are 3 CFL franchises in Ontario, Toronto, Ottawa, and Hamilton. There's one in Quebec and Montreal. If those provinces, which were the provinces that kind of had the worst of it in the early parts of COVID, if those provinces are reluctant to allow fans, even a limited number of fans in the stadiums by, September, say, then I think we're back to a situation where we're wondering if the CFL is going to go ahead with the season. That's kind of like the worst case scenario, though. I do think, having said that won't be what happens, and that we'll continue to see over the next few weeks that things are progressing, and then everyone will be okay with what the CFL is planning. They might even start with, the expectation is that they'll start with a bunch of games out west where the provinces seem a little more open to having fans in stands, and then it'll progress from there. But that is the one, the fly in the ointment is that one or two provinces might say, we're not signing off on this just yet. And ultimately the league needs assurances, right? Like they're not going to start moving. They're not going to start bringing players back and open training camps and things until they can be 100% certain that the schedule that they have mapped out is something they're going to be able to do.
Has there been any movement in terms of, we haven't touched on this in a while, has there been any movement in terms of the potential of a government loan to the CFL? We know they got turned down for a no interest loan. Has there been any movement on that, or is that kind of still?
That is not in the cards. There has been a little bit of reporting, basically just people checking in and saying, hey, is this a possibility at this time around? And it's no more likely to happen now than it was a year ago. So I think that's why they're, put it this way, they're making plans to have a season with a federal loan not being part of those plans. So I don't think anything really hinges on it in terms of money from the government, support from the government. There'll probably be different things they might try to do to help get things off the ground again, but nothing in terms of financially backstopping the league so that they could play this year.
Something that I'm curious about, and, obviously they turned down the bubble. We didn't do the bubble last year. we don't want to do the bubble this year. We're talking, shipping some of the teams out west. I even saw like 3 Down had an opinion piece the other day about playing, finding a couple stadiums and playing everything. How does that that revenue? Do we know how that would work? Like if one team is playing and another team, it's fan driven. I mean, I hear that a lot, right? That was when Ambrosie came out and said, that was the big plan. But I'm like, if we need the fans in and we need the money from the fans, but yet there's no revenue share in that way, how would that? Do we know how that would work?
We don't know. Again, because so much of this is hypothetical and back a napkin kind of stuff. And even when the commissioner is saying, well, what we could do is potentially start out west, they weren't saying, and as part of that, they would split the revenues or whatever. I mean, I guess you could theorize that if they start playing games out west, then that just means the eastern teams are going to have a bunch of road games early and a bunch of home games late, and the attendance stuff will all kind of balance itself out. Or they could do something where they agree to split gate revenues more equitably than they might previously have done. I mean, in CFL terms, that's a whole nother ball of wax, because there are certain teams that have really good attendance and there's certain teams that don't. And there are, maybe that doesn't matter if you're only having 5,000 people in a stadium anyway, but historically that would not fly, because the Saskatchewans and the Winnipegs and the Edmontons of the world don't want to be having to share gate revenue at a significant amount with a team like Toronto, which doesn't get nearly as many fans. So I assume this is one of those things when Ambrosie talks about this stuff that could all kind of be worked out, but it certainly would fit under the category of details that have not really been discussed publicly yet.
When you talk about this, being back in napkin writing, ideas, right, theories, I mean, you've covered this league obviously a lot longer than we have. Is that par for the course? Is that terrifying? Is that somewhere in between?
Well, that's a good question. I think in the Ambrosie era, there has been an awful lot of like big ideas and things that get talked about as this is something we want to do, and we're really excited about it. And then when you drill down a bit further, you go, how's that going to work exactly? And the commissioner, one of his great strengths is to be very enthusiastic and to be a big salesman and to say, no, it's going to be awesome and this will work. And I don't know how familiar you guys are with the whole global expansion project that he's been on for a few years now. But my perspective from the moment it was dropped was like, wait, so you're going to get like a couple of guys from Mexico and Finland and Germany, and they're going to be on your practice roster, and Germany's going to care about that some way? Like I've never really understood that part of it, because the whole idea of that global expansion would be you are creating interest in these other countries in the CFL specifically, and just having a smattering of guys from around the world as part of the league, I don't think is going to make a CFL fan out of some random dude in Frankfurt. But and so having said all that, I kind of feel it's a little bit the same way with this pandemic reaction, in that the commissioner and his office and the league are often like coming up with things that they think will work, and maybe it'll be a bubble, and maybe it'll be this thing, and maybe we'll start things off out there. And often the details are kind of left for you to sort of sort out yourself, and maybe they'll come out with something a bit more firm. But I do think, as much as this is me kind of poking fun at them, if I'm a season ticket holder of whatever team it might be, I think you could rightly say at this point that you've gotten very little assurances that there's going to be a season, that you're going to be able to go to it, that whatever deposit you gave them before the 2020 season was canceled is going to be honored. And that's the part that I think, and I'm certainly not the only person to say it, but there's been concern that the transparency from the league offices over this whole period has been scant.
What happens if there's not a season?
Well, look, I don't think any league can not play for 2 years and continue to operate in anything like its normal function. I mean, at some point the players are going to say, we're going to go do something else. And And especially, guys, given like everywhere else has been playing, it's not the CFL is not the only league that's had some challenges, but whether it's the major pro sports, which we all know have of course come back and operated, are now in like season 2 during the pandemic, but even much smaller things, the WNBA, the NWSL soccer, there's a small little Canadian soccer league that's only been around for a couple of years, like a very lower tier professional organization, but even they played in the bubble last year. So at some point, like, you have to kind of put up or shut up. And I think that's a thing that the league's going to have to decide. And if they are sort of rolling with the idea that they're going to get some sort of fans in the stadium to offset the operating losses. But to my mind, they're going to have to come to a decision point and say, we're going to have to go ahead with this thing, even if it means we might not have the fans in the stands that we ultimately hope to have. Because I just don't think you can not have it for another year. I think that's absurd and a ridiculous ask of your fans and your employees, and especially your players.
Could they have done anything different to maybe
operate?
Operate in turn and withstand this.
Yeah, I think they should have played last year, to be honest with you. I think it exposed the financial problems of the league, and the fact that there are certain franchises in particular that don't make enough money even in normal times, and they didn't want to lose even more money in difficult times. But I think that was a decision that was bad for the league ultimately, and they have ownership groups that are, some of them are backed by a lot of money, big corporations, that kind of thing. And I think the move should have been to just play and to keep people interested in the game, and to say, you know what, this is going to be tough, but maybe we can get some support. Whatever the loan, we've never really known what the loan provisions were with the federal government. The report, of course, is that they wanted an interest-free loan of $30 million. They probably could have got some sort of financing at some sort of acceptable interest rate. I mean, the Canadian government was handing out lots of money to all sorts of different organizations during the pandemic when things were closed. And I think looking back, I'm not sure Randy Ambrosie would ever admit it, but I think they should have played last year and then set themselves up for something again this year. So we'll see what happens. I still think, if you're to ask me what my optimism of the fact that there's going to be a season, I think there'll be a season. I'd probably say there's a 80% chance there'll be a season, but there is that possibility that something screws it up along the way. Something that
I've been, because I spend way too much time with all this stuff now, something that we do, for fun, but something that I've been pondering about, obviously last year they had the vote, certain teams didn't want to play. Yeah. We've been hedging our bets, fans in the stadiums, we need that to go ahead. Obviously Bob Young came out with the Ticats and all that last week. Hey, we're going to play in the Red Blacks and all that. What if we get here close and some of the teams still just don't want to play, right? Even if we can get 10% of the fans in. Have we thought, that's what I'm thinking at this point. Yeah. I actually think the bigger wrench in the works, potentially, I'll get to your question in a second, Reed, but the other potential problem is the border. Right now, the border is theoretically closed. It's not really closed between Canada and the U.S., but you can drive across it if you're an essential worker or a traveler. Airline travel essentially is close to the point where you're supposed to go into a expensive hotel quarantine if you arrive via air. So one of the challenges with setting up any sorts of training camp scenario is they're going to have to allow players and staff to come back in some way that is different than the rules for the general public right now. Is that a huge hurdle? No, it's not a massive hurdle, because they did it with the NHL playoffs. They said, okay, if you come back, you only have to quarantine for a week, and it'll not be a massive burden. It was normally a 14-day quarantine. They let it be a week. They didn't worry about the hotels. So they can do that kind of stuff. But the question is, are people Canadians, or is the public going to get really annoyed at politicians who are all of a sudden making exceptions for CFL players returning? Again, I think it's entirely possible that could all be handled relatively pain-free.
But I also sort of wonder when you have provincial leaders who are kind of fighting with the federal government over the border closures and not doing enough to keep people out and so on and so forth, will they then turn around and welcome returning CFL players? So that's a question. The larger question that you ask about whether certain teams will be reluctant, again, I got to think that by this point, if you own a CFL franchise and you're sitting there saying, no, I'd rather not play in 2021 and go 2 years without this team taking the field, you should not be in this business because it's just absurd. Like, the league has to play. You cannot expect these guys to sit out 2 years. As we all know, professional athletes and football players in particular have short careers. So it's insane to imagine that they would sit out another year. I think, I don't know what, ultimately drove the decision, the votes last summer to not proceed. I mean, obviously it was money was a big part of it, but I just think so much has happened between now and then. You've got some indication that unless things go horribly wrong, which nobody expects to happen, by some point in the fall, you'll be able to have fans in the stands, even in the eastern cities. So you just have to kind of go with it. And if that means that maybe you're taking a bit of a risk that you will have fewer fans in the stands than you might have hoped, then I think that's just the risk you have to take, because the alternative is I just don't think an option for the league.
And that alternative being
not playing or doing something where they sit out 2021 and they come back in 2022 with some sort of merger with whatever the XFL might be at that point too. So, those are, I would say, the very big picture possibilities, but it would seem very strange to me that would be the way they wanted the Canadian Football League to come to its end, was to basically not exist for 2 years and then come back in a completely altered form with a merger with another league and all that stuff. So that to me seems like not something anybody in the league or amongst the ownership would be really looking to do. That's not to say that the merger and something like that couldn't also happen, but I'd be shocked if they were looking at it as the logical next move beyond the last time they took the field as the CFL as we know it.
So what are your thoughts on the merger?
Well, I mean, without knowing anything about what a merger might ultimately look like, I think there's no way for there to be a merger or a cooperation of any significant amount between the two leagues without one of them essentially giving up its identity. And the one that would do that in that scenario is the Canadian Football League. I mean, the big things for the CFL are it plays over the summer and into the fall. Starts in the spring, plays in summer and into the fall. And it has a big field and 3 downs and different rules, 12 guys on the field, some other stuff that, of course, anybody who follows the league would know. I just don't see how you take an American football league and combine it with all the things that are unique about the CFL and don't essentially give away the store at that point, because you can't really operate a league where there's one set of leagues for one set of rules for one series of games, one set of rules for a different series of games. If the merger, quote unquote, is like the winner of the CFL sometimes plays the winner of the XFL in some kind of exhibition type game or championship game, or whatever you want to call it, maybe something like that can be figured out. I think there'd still be some questions about the timing of the league, like how that works with the way the 2 seasons work would be a problem to overcome. But if it's any real merger where they're all playing each other and they're sort of having combined schedules, then I just don't think you have what the CFL is anymore. And if that's what the league and its owners and its administration decides is the only way for it to survive, then that's what they'll decide. But I think they'd be kind of kidding themselves if they think they could get into some sort of merger that doesn't fundamentally change what the people who are CFL fans have come to know it for.
So are you hesitant about that then, as someone that, I would assume loves the league that you cover?
Yeah, it's funny because I've covered the last 4 Grey Cups. I've written about the league and its challenges a lot, and I think in a way it's probably done as much of that relative to normal game coverage than a lot of people who follow the league, because I live in Toronto, or the Toronto area. So I'm in one of the markets that doesn't love the CFL. I mean, it just doesn't. There's too much other competition. There's a whole, we can go on for days about the challenges facing the CFL in the big Canadian markets, which are Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. So I've often felt like these are real problems that this league's going to have a hard time solving, because they've been in place for quite some time, and they've only kind of gotten worse over time. So I guess what I'm going for there is I acknowledge that the league has some challenges, and they don't seem to have any easy solutions to them. And maybe a merger with the XFL is the solution. It's basically an acknowledgement that we've been fighting these same battles all the time. We're trying to get new people interested in Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver. We haven't been able to do it. I just think that it would be a shame if it came about in these circumstances where, they were doing stuff. They thought they were moving ahead with growing the game, growing the league through these global initiatives and stuff. And then they basically, because of the pandemic, decide to give up and go for some sort of merger. To me, that would be a disappointing way for the CFL to come to an end in the way we know it. Because, when Randy Ambrosie was hired, I think it was 2017, he was very much like a guy who cared about the league, played in the league, was a huge CFL booster and supporter, and has been for most of his time going around trying to draw up interest in the league and talking about how great it is. And people like me, where I was saying, look, man, your problem is simpler. You need to figure out how to get Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver on board with your league. And he kind of went off in this other thing about global expansion and trying to do other stuff. And now it seems like he's having whatever these discussions are with the XFL. And to me, that's the missed opportunity is the key to making the CFL a league that can survive and be viable is to just increase the interest in it in some of the markets where the interest is weak. And if they decide that they can't do that, and that the only opportunity going forward is some sort of merger, then I guess that's what they'll do.
Why couldn't the rules from Canada football, just carry over? Why can't we play Canadian rules with this XFL potential merger?
You mean like the whole of the league plays Canadian rules?
Yeah.
For example?
Yeah. What's stopping?
Well, I mean, they could. They certainly could if that's the way, Dwayne Johnson and his business partners want to play it. My guess would be that, and this is just my assumption, is that the number of players who are willing, the players, the coaches, like it just becomes a fundamentally different game than the football that people are used to, whether it's U.S. college or NFL. And to be honest, I'm like, that's one of those things. It's a great question in that, being somebody who covers this league, and obviously I watch NFL football as well. It's so hard to know the real answer to the question of which brand is actually better. Like in terms of, if you had the same players, like nobody's a real CFL fan doesn't fool themselves into thinking that they have better football players than the NFL does. Like no one's that stupid. They're obviously not. Those guys are better. They're better athletes, however you want to describe it. They're better at that certain skill set. They're getting paid 10 times what somebody in the CFL is getting paid. So to the extent that you believe with any sort of meritocracy, I think we would agree that the NFL's players are better at football. But the question is, like, if you took CFL rules and you applied it to a similar group of football players, would the game be better? I actually don't know what the answer to that is, and I think a lot of CFL fans would accuse me of selling out the country or something for saying that. But there are lots of CFL games that can look pretty bad. Like it's when you only have the 3 downs, it can be a lot of punts, and it's just like punt. It can be harder for drives to get going. When it works really well, it's extremely enjoyable to watch because it's a lot of passing. It's a lot of big passing, because you're trying to gain big chunks of yardage a lot. If you get a sack on first down and it's 2nd and 20, then probably they're throwing deep because otherwise it's a punt. So it can be exciting. I just think that it's such a different game that it would be a harder sell, I think, for the XFL or the XFL or whatever you want to call it, to kind of sell itself as this wacky football that a lot of American football fans wouldn't be familiar with. I've just always kind of assumed that the XFL wants to at least look like the NFL, even though I acknowledge that they did a lot of rule changes and things like that last time around to try to be innovative and to be different. So, but I do think that the CFL's brand is perhaps a bit too innovative relative to what the football you guys are used to watching down there.
Yeah, I would do anything if I was a fly on the wall and try to keep some of these rules. I mean, we said that before. It is fascinating to me when you mentioned when Ambrosie came in and you said, hey, build within, right? Build the 3 markets. He ended up doing the global thing, right? Going to Mexico, yep. Europe. And now here we are again. We need to build here. And instead, he's looking down south and talking to The Rock and stuff. I think that's a fascinating repeating of history here in the last couple of years.
Yeah, and look, like the situation in Toronto, again, just to give you a bit of background, like they played in the Rogers Centre, which is where the Blue Jays played. And for the longest time, it was kind of assumed, well, the big problem is they don't get enough fans to really make that stadium work. Like it's a big stadium that can seat 50,000. If you had 20,000 people in it, it kind of felt empty, and you could hear like echoes of cheers and stuff. And so the thought was, well, if they ever get a little bit smaller, maybe an outdoor stadium, the whole thing would change. And then they did. They ended up moving into the stadium that Toronto FC, the MLS team, plays in. It's significantly smaller. It's outdoors. It's by the water. It's a really nice place to watch a football game. But it hasn't made a significant impact at all in attendance. In fact, the attendance has gone down since it's there. So the problems in Toronto were clearly beyond just the stadium issue. Montreal has been sold now, bought by 2 guys from Ontario who basically have yet to see them play a game because they bought it at the end of the 2019 season. But it was on the market for a long time and was not a hot property at all. It took a long time for that sale to get finalized. Vancouver, the BC team, has been trying to be sold for the better part of a decade. And now the former owner of that team has passed away. So it's controlled by his estate. No one seems to know what's going to happen there. Again, like the asking price is just not what anybody in the market is willing to pay, because those 3 franchises are not profitable. So that speaks to the problem in those markets. I mean, you guys see this in any number of other sports. MLS, which has its own problems, like they can sell expansion franchises for hundreds of millions of dollars, and those things are valuable. And the CFLs, the franchises in those markets just haven't been valuable. So that's for a long time been the problem that needs to be solved. And obviously nobody expected Randy Ambrosie to wave a magic wand and suddenly fix those problems. But it seems a shame that they haven't been able to make any progress, given how enthusiastic he has been about the league and how much he seems to be a guy who has big ideas. Like none of them seem to have translated yet to increased interest in those few markets. And I just point out to you guys, they're big cities. Like it shouldn't be that hard to get people for 9 football games over the course of a year. But so far they haven't been able to unlock it.
My last question for you before we let you go, because I do really want to get your thoughts on this. We're going to be talking more today about the sports betting. We covered that last week, right? Obviously it's, going through the Senate and all that. For the life of me, and we talked and we got a lot of feedback, I can't for the life of me figure out where all this where it's going to be the savior, right? I spent all last night listening to Farhan on Derek Taylor. I listened to Dunk and Hodge talk about it. This $10 to $20 million, right? They project per year for the CFL. First off, that's coming from like sponsorships of, having rooms in stadiums for, because you don't get the money on the bets, right? And then second, Ambrosie's saying, on a good year, the league loses 10 to 20 million. And so, Dunk last night on the podcast, he goes, we'll see if we get 20 million from the betting, that covers the losses. Then all we got to do is figure out the 3 teams that you're already talking, right? Montreal and whatever. Yeah. And we're going to be good to go. And I'm like, okay, so you're using this to cover the losses and we're still in the same crappy situation we are. Right? I mean, am I missing something? I mean, we feel the same way on this. Are we missing something about the sports betting?
Look, I think the idea that there's going to be this giant pot of money that's going to suddenly be opened up for the CFL, gambling there's going to be revenues there that weren't previously there. That much is obvious. But to your point, Reed, there's going to be companies that are trying to get into the NHL in Canada, into MLB with Toronto and NBA with the Raptors. I don't think you can just assume that FanDuel or DraftKings or whoever are going to be just giving boatloads of money to the CFL just to get their logos on the field. I mean, it kind of gets back to the same problem. If people aren't into the league and betting on your product as much as they are NFL or NHL or something like that, then I don't necessarily think you're going to be the number one place where those dollars are going. There's going to be some revenue there for sure, but I don't think you can just guarantee that it's going to be $20 million or whatever optimistic number that Randy Ambrosie wants to put on. So that's a big part of it. I also think there's just not a big gambling market on the CFL. There are no doubt CFL people that would disagree, but
I'm sure they are. I'm sure they will.
Whereas on any given weekend, I'm aware that Kansas City Chiefs are 7-point favorites over the Vegas Raiders and what the lines are in NFL games and stuff like that. The CFL just is not a very odds oriented business. It just isn't. Like people might know what some of these lines are in the over unders, but and this might be a little bit of somebody who is from Toronto, but nobody's talking about like a 3-team parlay that they're taking out on the CFL schedule this weekend. It's just not been a thing. So I think there could be some money there and some revenue that didn't previously exist, but it wouldn't solve the fundamental problems, as you say, of interest in the league in the 3 big cities. And so, yeah, it's a bit of money. It would help, but it doesn't solve any of the long-term issues, which are the demographics in those 3 cities just have kind of shifted away from being CFL fans. And so that problem would still have to be solved. I guess the most optimistic take for a Randy Ambrosie or anybody like that would be, well, if we can get a little money in the door in the short term, then that buys us some time to try to solve these long-term problems. So I guess that would be my most optimistic vision of how legalized gambling on its own could provide a bit of a lifeline to the CFL.
All right. Scott Stinson, National Post writer, want to thank you for your time and coming on here and talking CFL stuff with us.
And I promise I'm not going to put when you said the merger may be the solution. I'm not going to clip that for the promo and have you saying that the merger is the solution.
Look, guys, obviously they're talking so. As much as there are people on this side of the border who might be like, "That's nonsense. It's never going to go anywhere." They wouldn't be having discussions if they didn't think it was a possibility. Is my take.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.